Yo, what's the deal? It's your boy Danny HenDog. Welcome to the HenDog Half. It is August 2nd, Tuesday, and we are live from Lowell, Massachusetts on a kind of cloudy day, but the sun is peeking out here and there as the clouds travel by. So today's episode is one of my favorites to do for the research and development part, but today we'll be talking about what the fuck is Ultimate Fighting Championships. Ultimate Fighting Championships is one of my favorite things to watch, but to start it off, we're going to talk about what martial arts is. A martial art, as defined by Wikipedia, is a codified system and traditions of combat practiced by the reasons of self-defense, military, law enforcement, and physical competition. So the as defined right there by Wikipedia, which is one of the most trusted sources on the internet, is martial arts is a practice. It is a tradition. What it does is it is punches, kicks, and all of these systems are combined into a martial art. You have a skill at being able to defend yourself, and it was taught in the military, it was taught in law enforcement. And the history of to start off, one of the most famous martial arts started in Japan. In Japan, karate was started, both the Shotokan style of karate and the Okinawan style of karate. There's different styles of karate from the different areas of Japan of where you're from. Japan also had the origins of jujitsu and also had the origins of ninjutsu. Ninjutsu being more of an espionage type martial art where you're almost killing people without even being seen, like the art of invisibility, to quote my man Master Splinter. So from Japan, you got going down through Asian countries. The Koreans in Korea had an art called Taekwondo. Taekwondo being based off of kicks and being based off of different styles of kicks, whether it be roundhouse kicks, wheel kicks, back kicks. All of these different types of kicks and combinations too created the martial art of Taekwondo. And then from Taekwondo, you go to Thailand, and in Thailand, they created Muay Thai. Muay Thai is called the art of eight limbs. Eight limbs meaning that in the sport or in the martial art of Muay Thai, you could use both your fist, both your elbows, both your knees, and both your feet in order to attack your opponent and win points, or knock them out and win the match, or God forbid you have to defend yourself. You know how to use all eight limbs, all eight parts of your limbs. So that is the art that was created in Thailand. And then we keep on cruising now into Russia. Russia has a sport called Sambo, which is very similar to wrestling, except they wear like the karate gi also. Here's a video of Sambo. I really don't know much about Sambo, so I can't really get into it, but you can see these videos right here. It's a very cool style of self-defense. And then you have the ancient civilizations coming in through Europe. You know, they had their own martial arts. I spoke about it in the Fight Life of Wrestling, one of the older episodes here on the Hen Dog Half. We spoke about the Greeks being the creators of wrestling, and the Olympics, and how the wrestling came up through that lineage in the ancient civilizations, all the way through the Romans, and then through what is now what was historically Europe and now is modern day Europe. But in those ancient civilizations, wrestling and boxing were the big sports that came out of the European parts of the world. So as we're moving closer through the prime meridian, and now into over the Atlantic Ocean, we get to Brazil. In Brazil, they took the art of jiu-jitsu from Japan. When people immigrated back and forth through countries, when travel became easy, jiu-jitsu art from Japan came to Brazil, and Brazil put their own style to it. Japanese brought over their traditional arts of jiu-jitsu, and then the Brazilians put their own style to it, their own South American Latino style to it, and now formed an art of grappling, of ground fighting, based off of chokes, based off of arm locks, off of leg locks. And when I say locks, I mean you put your opponent or the person you're fighting against, you take their limb and you hyper extend it. You try to break it. You try to turn that joint turning the other way. And that is what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is all about. They took the Japanese style of Jiu-Jitsu, which is based on the judo styles of throws and catches, and then they took it and turned it into a submission art on the ground. It is called the gentle art. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So now, through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, there was a man called Helio Gracie. Helio Gracie right here in the picture now. Helio Gracie started teaching all of his sons and all of their uncles and aunts and everybody in that Gracie family. If you look at the family tree of the Gracies, you probably Google it. Here's a picture of it right now. There are a lot of Gracies, and they all came out of Brazil, and they made Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu an art that was not known around the world, but that was very, very effective in fighting, in street fighting, in defending yourself. They took the art of from Japan and put their twist on it and made it a very, very effective martial art in their country. So from these gyms that they were creating, they were starting to teach more and more people in Brazil Jiu-Jitsu. Helio Gracie and his family, his sons Horian Gracie and Hoyler Gracie, they're actually spelt with R's but pronounced with an H because of the Portuguese accent. So I know it took me a while to figure that one out too. But so with Helio Gracie, with the sons coming up, they started going over to different gyms that were different styles of martial arts in Brazil, whether it be karate, whether it be taekwondo. These Gracie brothers, these Gracie family used to go to these gyms and used to challenge the master of that school and say, hey, I am going to fight you with jiu-jitsu, and we are going to have a fight, and we're going to see what the more effective art is. And here are some videos of what is now known as the Gracie Challenge. In hindsight 2020, the Gracie Challenge was just guys going and starting fights at different gyms in order to prove that their art was the strongest. And it's funny to me because, like it's starting fights. You're going to a gym and being like, hey, I could beat you up with my art. But this is how they made Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu famous in the South American parts of the world. And then as they came up, the brothers started moving into California. And then in California in the 80s, they started doing the same thing. They started going to different gyms and started to challenge these different masters and these different teachers and saying that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the best art in order to defend yourself and in order to be the dominant martial art. When they started doing these gym challenges, the idea struck to one of the brothers called Horian Gracie. Horian Gracie thought that they could start an event where they could do exactly what they were doing in these Gracie competitions, these Gracie challenges when they would go to different gyms, except put it in the limelight, put it on the stage. And he teamed up with a man named Art Barr, and they created what the very first event was called the Ultimate Fighting Championships. This was in November 12th, 1993, UFC 1. In UFC 1, it was Horian's idea to display to the world and show that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the dominant art in the world. And very similar to those Bloodsport movies and kickboxer movies like Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal in the 80s, now you're actually going to have a real life tournament of different martial arts in order to prove which martial art was the most effective. And this was the birth of UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championships, mixed martial arts. So who's going to win in a fight? Jiu-Jitsu versus Taekwondo. Who's going to win in a fight? A wrestler versus a boxer. These questions were going to be answered now by the Ultimate Fighting Championships. The Ultimate Fighting Championships was a one-night tournament. Royce Gracie, who was the youngest of the sons from the Helio Gracie family in Brazil, he went through the brackets. He won his first match by submission, I believe. Here are some clips of him beating up everybody in UFC 1. But although he was taking punishment, and he was a lot smaller than a lot of these dudes, and he went through this tournament, fought 3 different fights, beat Ken Shamrock, who wound up being one of the more famous mixed martial artists later in the years. Royce Gracie dominated this tournament, and he showed the world that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the best premier martial art in order to defend yourself. And he proved that to the world by beating up everybody in this Ultimate Fighting Championships, the very first event. And just like the Gracie challenges that happened in historical Brazil and in historical California, like 80s historical, if you want to consider that history, it was the proof that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the dominant art in real life fighting. But the UFC in general, when you watch the UFC again as an adult, it is a train wreck. UFC 1 was just filled with sumo guys. There was a guy here wearing a tank top. It was a lot of just, they called themselves martial artists, but it was very, very looked very unprofessional. It wasn't the crisp productions that is now the UFC. But hey, you have to start off from somewhere. So this low budget type UFC show wound up being the birth of mixed martial arts in America. And after that, the first 5 events started happening in 1993, 1994, 1995. MMA was born in America. And Royce Gracie, the jiu-jitsu artist, used to win all those tournaments, those beginning tournaments, those one-night tournaments. But as the UFC started progressing more and more, it started really fast going into the dark ages of MMA, because the dark ages of MMA are around this 95 to 98 time. In this time, Ultimate Fighting Championships or mixed martial arts started being banded all over the country. It was seen as violent and brutal. It was seen as human cockfighting. Senator John McCain, right here, my man who ran against Barack Obama back in 2008, he was one of the guys in the Senate that was saying that this mixed martial arts was not a good thing for anybody. It was barroom brawling, no holds barred, and it just made it look really, really bad for public relations for mixed martial arts and Ultimate Fighting Championships. Because of the illegalizations in many states, a lot of their events, they would plan an event and then a senator or a governor would come down and cancel the event, which would be bad for UFC buys because they need to sell pay-per-views and they need to get those pay-per-view buys. And if no one's buying the pay-per-view or they have to cancel the pay-per-view, they're not making any money. So in the dark ages of the UFC, it was not good to be illegalized in all states, and it was not good to be seen as human cockfighting. It was no good for the sport, and it just made MMA fighters look bad at this time. But through here, a man named Dana White was managing a bunch of fighters in the UFC of this time, about 1998, 1999. And he, together with the Fertitta brothers in Las Vegas, the Fertitta brothers run casinos in Las Vegas, he came together and bought the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship Company. He bought all the copyrights, he bought all the events, and what he did was he was going to now, together with the Nevada Athletic Commission, he was going to create the UFC, make rules, unified rules for mixed martial arts, and start treating it more as a sport instead of just no hold bar fighting of like just 2 random guys going in and being too gassed up and not having enough cardio and not being athletic looking in order to win these fights. Now he was going to turn the Ultimate Fighting Championships into a legitimate sport. So through the Nevada Athletic Commission, they started the unified rules of mixed martial arts. The rules of MMA are very clean cut with the explanation, but then the interpretation of it through the judges and through the referees can be seen as a very big gray area. But as the text is written, and then shout outs to the MMA Fighting and then MMA On Point, the YouTube show, who gave me this explanation for the rules of mixed martial arts. So the Nevada Athletic Commission created the unified MMA rules, which consist of the rounds being 5 minutes, a normal mixed martial arts bout will be 3 rounds, and a championship fight will be 5 rounds. Each round is 5 minutes. In this fight and throughout the rounds, the fight can immediately end by knockout, which means you punch a guy or you kick a guy or you kick a girl in the head and they fall and they're out. They're not responding to the referee. They could win by knockout. You could win by submission. Submission is a tap out, whether you get put in an arm bar, whether you get put in a choke. You could say tapping out means I give up. And you could also verbally say I tap. And then you have the technical knockout. The technical knockout is when you can no longer defend yourself and the referee needs to stop the fight. All of these 3 reasons are a way to get the fight stopped immediately and you win. There's also the other referee stoppages, which is based on disqualification. If you poke a guy in the eye, or if you punch a girl in the like, if you make illegal strikes, you could get disqualified. And then also you can do referee stoppage by an injury. When you get injured, that means you break a leg. Unfortunately, it happened to Conor McGregor, and you can no longer continue the fight. Those are the ways for a fight to immediately end and make a clean-cut winner and a clean-cut loser. From there, if you don't win by knockout, submission, or technical knockout, the TKO, then you get to the judge's decision. That means you go to all 15 minutes in a fight, and a regular mixed martial art match, or in a championship fight, all 25 minutes, all 5 rounds. If you get that far and you know there is no clean-cut winner, you get to the judge's decision. If the fight doesn't end by knockout, submission, or technical knockout, if the referee says you can't continue anymore, it goes to the judge's scorecards. The judge's scorecards are based on a 10-point system. And in this 10-point system, they base it on effective striking and grappling first. That is the biggest factor. So if you're punching and you're kicking and you're doing it effectively, which means you're connecting to the head, you're connecting to the body, you're not throwing wasted punches, that is good for the scorecards. Then from the effective striking, you go to effective grappling. Are you taking the guy down? Are you keeping him on the ground? Are you going for submissions? And then all of these punches and kicks, are they cumulative? That is a word I can't pronounce. Cumulative, in order to make you look like the dominant fighter in that round. If you are the dominant fighter in that round, you get 10 points. And if you are the non-dominant fighter, if you are not throwing effective striking, if you are not defending yourself in the grappling, you get given the 9. And all rounds are based on this 10-point system. If you do all the striking and if you do all the grappling and everything is even, from there you go to aggressiveness and cage control and position control. That means is if your striking is exactly equal in the round and your grappling is exactly equal in the round, who was the more aggressor? Who was coming forward? Who was throwing the big punches? Which girl was throwing the big kicks? Which guy was throwing the big takedowns? This is now the last point in order for the judges to weigh the decision. So you got effective striking, effective grappling, and then you got the aggressiveness and cage control. This is how the judges score the bout. And with this decision, you could either become a majority decision, which means all 3 judges go for one fighter. It could be a split decision, which means two judges go for one fighter and one judge went for another fighter. Or it could be a majority draw. A draw means all 3 judges are undecided on who the winner was. Both fighters were very equal, and it has happened a few times throughout the UFC history. With these rules and then adding weight classes, which means now it's not just going to be like the first UFC events where it's going to be like a sumo wrestler versus a small boxer. Now it is going to be more like boxing, where you're going to get weight classes where you're going to fight in depending on your weight. So in the beginnings of the UFC, you had the lightweight, which was 155. You had the middleweight, which was 185. You had the heavyweight, which was 215 and over. And these were the first weight classes that were based on the unified systems from the Nevada Athletic Commission. And also, too, you started using gloves. And in mixed martial arts, you use a different type of glove from boxing. So here we got the hot model coming on. This is a boxing glove, a traditional boxing glove. This boxing glove weighs 12 to 16 ounces, and it is for the sport of boxing. They modified it. As you can see, it's a closed mitt and a big thumb. They modified this type of glove in mixed martial arts for our second hot model, the mixed martial art glove. And the mixed martial art glove is a little bit smaller. It's an 8-ounce glove, and it has a strap at the end of it like you'll see in the UFC fights, and then it has an open palm style. And as I put this glove on, and I did not really practice this earlier, so you're going to see me struggle for a hot second, but as we get the glove on, what happens is you see that it is an open palm style of glove. So you're allowed to grapple now more effectively with this open palm versus the boxing glove, which is all closed. So with the mixed martial arts gloves, with the weight classes, and now basing the majority decisions and the split decisions from the judges and how they score the mixed martial arts bout, we have effective rules. No more. And this is where the UFC entered its first golden age. In the year 2001, after the Fertitta brothers and Dana White take over the UFC, all the pay-per-views start improving. All the events start having more pageantry, having better production, and just overall looking better. Here's an example of some of the beginning UFCs. It's just everything about it looks so much better. And this is the times when Joe Rogan was coming in to the mix also. But with this first golden age of the UFC, the pioneer fighters coming up in this era were Randy Couture, who was an Olympic wrestler on the wrestling team for the Olympics. You had Chuck Liddell, who was a Division I wrestler from Cal Polytech, and he also was a black belt in karate. And then you had Tito Ortiz. Tito Ortiz right here. He was a Division I wrestler in California State University, and he was also a black belt in jiu-jitsu. These guys were the pioneers at the beginnings of the UFC being owned by Dana White, and they would revolve a lot of these pay-per-views, a lot of these title bouts were revolved around these guys, and these guys had separate, different title reigns throughout their weight classes, and they had some of the best fights ever. This is a great time for the UFC to become popular. More eyes were on it. A lot more people were watching. And this is why I call this part the UFC's first golden age, because this is when the pay-per-views were coming up, and this is when you saw it a lot more in pop culture. Ken Shamrock, who was a participant in the first UFC bouts, he won, I think, UFC 4, UFC 5. Don't quote me on that. You can look that up on Wikipedia. But Ken Shamrock went to the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, which was at this time a lot more popular than the UFC, and gave UFC a branding in those shows through the wrestling community. And that's how I personally came through the Ultimate Fighting Championships in the late 90s and the early 2000s, was Ken Shamrock fighting in the World Wrestling Federation. And you also had an episode of Friends, that very popular 90s sitcom going into the 2000s also, where Monica, one of the characters, is dating a guy who wants to be a UFC fighter. And they actually have a UFC fight on the Friends episode. I hope I'm able to get a clip of that. But that's another shout out in pop culture during the early 2000s for the UFC. And then the creation of The Ultimate Fighter. The Ultimate Fighter was a competition show where, just like the Real World Road Rules Challenge and all those type shows, where they would put like 10 fighters or 10 people in a house and live together and fight together and train together, just like the real world, where it was 8 people who would come and live together in an apartment and then work a job together. Very similar. So the Ultimate Fighter show, it was on Spike TV, really popularized the brand of UFC in pop culture. It started getting a lot more viewers, more people were watching. The Ultimate Fighter was a really, really good show in order to introduce fighters, in order to show their backgrounds, in order to show their struggles in training. You know, a lot of people think that it was a no-holds-barred encounter in a UFC, but this changed a lot of people's opinions and saw that it was really being treated as a real sport. The Ultimate Fighter popularized UFC in television, and then it started creating events, and all of these events were in Las Vegas in the early times. The Hard Rock Cafe, I remember some of the events being, the MGM Grand. Las Vegas was the pinnacle point of mixed martial arts during this first golden age, and it was a great time to watch it. This is when I first started watching the Ultimate Fighting Championships, and for me, it's one of my favorite times because I used to love watching Tito Ortiz talk smack on all the press conferences, Chuck Liddell knocking people out, and then there was a big scene in Japan too with Pride Fighting Championships. Pride Fighting Championships was fought in a boxing ring, but it was Japan's UFC. They had a lot of great fights, and a lot of great fighters from Brazil were introduced there. A lot of great fighters from Russia were introduced there also. The UFC was bringing in more viewers and bringing in more pay-per-view buys. And this is where the UFC entered what I like to call the tap-out era. The tap-out era started around that, I would say, 2006, 2007 time, when the Ultimate Fighting show was very, very popular. I call it the tap-out era because everyone was wearing tap-out shirts. You would go to the malls, you would go to the schools, you would see people on the bus. Everybody was wearing a tap-out shirt and Affliction shirt. And this popularized the era of UFC for UFC fighters that were in the pay-per-views in the 80s and the 90s. Not the 80s years and 90s years, but UFC 80, UFC 90. It was at this time that a fighter coming up named George St. Pierre started dominating the welterweight division, the 170-pound division. George St. Pierre is the model of what a modern mixed martial artist is now. Every fighter that you see today, all the champions you see now, were probably watched George St. Pierre, and this is when he was coming up as champion. He would dominate opponents both with striking. He was a black belt in Shotokan karate. He was a wrestler on the Canadian wrestling team, and he was also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And don't quote me on the Canadian wrestling. I want to say he practiced with them. I remember hearing that that's part of his training. I don't think he was an official member of the team, but he was a very good wrestling base. So George St. Pierre was started beating people left and right in the welterweight division. Along that side, there was fighters like Matt Hughes, BJ Penn. These guys were coming up and making mixed martial arts into a real sport. These were real athletes, and they were dominating their divisions. They were fighting each other, and they were making great pay-per-views. A lot more people were watching. The sport was getting very popularized around this time, the tap-out era. And I myself had 2 tap-out shirts, and they were great looking. I wish I still had them now. I think that I use them as gym shirts now, but hey, tap-out is cool as hell. And also in this tap-out era, it was UFC 100. At this point, Brock Lesnar was dominating the heavyweight division in the UFC. Brock Lesnar was very popular in the World Wrestling Federation as a professional wrestler, and he brought a lot more eyes into the UFC when he started dominating the heavyweight division there. He was also a Division I NCAA champion in wrestling, so he had legitimate self-defense skills, as in the point that he actually competed in real wrestling versus professional wrestling, which is a scripted sport. Fight Life of Wrestling, check out that episode. But Brock Lesnar was able to dominate the heavyweight division, and he came in during this tap-out era also. With Brock Lesnar, another big popular fighter during this time was Rampage Jackson, who's pictured here. Rampage Jackson used to wear a chain around his neck. He used to bark, he used to snarl, and he used to knock guys out. He used to slam guys in order to win fights. This guy was awesome, and he was a great face to put on the Ultimate Fighting Championship posters when they were trying to sell pay-per-views. The tap-out era solidified the UFC as a sport, and from this tap-out era, the popularization of it led to a Fox Sports deal where now they were going to be on the Fox Sports channels, and also, too, they were getting a lot more pay-per-view buys, and then came a dude named Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor did start his preliminary fights in this time of the tap-out era. So all the UFC was just red hot. Every division was competitive. All the champions were household names, and the UFC was blowing up. They got the Fox Sports Channel deal, which then led on to getting an ESPN deal, and now they are on ESPN+. So the UFC just rose from being a sport of just no holds barred, dudes punching each other in the privates and pulling hair and almost biting. I think that if I have a clip here of someone biting, I have it here right now. But it grew from that barroom brawl fighting, no holds barred fighting, to ESPN, run by the Nevada Athletic Commission, referees, MMA gloves, rules, rounds, weight classes. The UFC is one of my favorite things to watch as a sport, as an entertainment event. I spend the $60 for a great pay-per-view because I think it's worth it to watch these guys fight. And the Ultimate Fighting Championships now is a household name. And now to end this YouTube show about what the fuck is Ultimate Fighting Championships, I'm going to talk about some of my personal favorite fights that I have watched throughout the history of the Ultimate Fighting Championships. So, like I stated earlier, I started watching around 2005, 2006 times religiously. I knew about the sport before that because of Ken Shamrock and the WWF. Some of my favorites, starting off, it was in 2008, Jens Pulver versus Uriah Faber in the World Extreme Championships fights. This fight was just hands down grind. They were punching, they were kicking each other. There was a lot of wrestling going on. There were submissions by Uriah Faber, submission attempts. They went all 5 rounds and they were beating the crap out of each other. Every round was with intensity. We have some combinations here. Uriah Faber here with a good takedown. Round 2, it was all Uriah Faber. He was dominating with the takedowns again. And then round 3, you saw a little bit more dominating on the floor by Uriah Faber. But when I watched this fight live, it became one of my favorites automatically. Just the grind, and you seeing the toughness of Jens Pulver. Jens Pulver's taking punches. He's taking kicks. He's getting taken down. And there's no quit about him. I love that about Jens Pulver and watching this fight, Little Evil. I still talk about this fight even now in 2022. Another one of my favorite fights came out of UFC 100 from that tap-out era. UFC 100 had a great undercard too. Brock Lesnar was in the main event, but the undercard had George St. Pierre versus Thiago Alves from Brazil. George St. Pierre being the model of mixed martial artist, he came in and he had a dominating fight for the welterweight championships where he used wrestling in order to dominate his opponent. He had the Superman punch combinations here in the first round and another Superman punch combination to the second round that led right here into a takedown. He has some beautiful techniques. Like I say, he was a model of the mixed martial artist, the modern mixed martial artist. He was so good at every single art that he performed during a UFC fight. He went on to win a lot of championship fights, but this is just one of my favorites because of the wrestling. I was a wrestler in high school, so I love watching the wrestling techniques used in an Ultimate Fighting fight, and this was one of the best. George St. Pierre kills it with the takedowns and then winds up winning the fight through decision. Another fight that I love to death is Carlos Conduit versus Rory McDonald. We don't even have to get into the explanation of this fight. If you know Ultimate Fighting Championships, you know about this fight. These guys beat the tar out of each other, busted open. Rory McDonald's nose was broken in like 6 places. Rory McDonald had a busted lip that went up all the way to his eye. Yeah, their faces were rearranged in this fight, but there was no quit in either of these fighters. They went on to the 5 rounds into a TKO finally because Rory McDonald couldn't take the beating to his nose anymore. One of the greatest fights here. A lot of clips I was just showing while talking about that. I love watching this fight when I'm just bored and I want to see something on UFC Fight Pass. This is one of my favorite fights of all time. And then finally, this is the fight that I like just because of the irony of it. Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen for the middleweight title, the 185 title. These guys were talking a lot of smack before this fight. Chael Sonnen being very offensive to the Brazilian people. It was very riding the envelope, as they say. But when these guys fought, Chael Sonnen dominated the middleweight champion. Anderson Silva came in as champion, but he looked like an amateur compared to Chael Sonnen. Chael Sonnen in the first and second round started dominating his opponent with pure wrestling and pure ground and pound style. Ground and pound style is another form of grappling. Chael Sonnen dominates Anderson Silva with ground and pound techniques. That's when you're holding down your opponent and you're punching him in the face. You're punching him to the body. You're kneeing him to the body. Ground and pound style for 4 rounds straight. Chael Sonnen is dominating Anderson Silva, but Anderson Silva will not quit. Anderson Silva takes the beating. Anderson Silva's on his back for most of the first 4 rounds. Anderson Silva cannot find the solution to Chael Sonnen's wrestling and Chael Sonnen's ground and pound. And then after 4 dominating rounds by Chael Sonnen, Anderson Silva gets taken down by Chael Sonnen again at the beginning of the 5th, and somehow, in some way, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu style, finds Chael Sonnen in a triangle choke. The triangle choke is deep into Chael Sonnen's throat, as you see here. Chael Sonnen taps out. he gives up in the fifth and final round of the match. He was this close to winning the middleweight championship in the UFC, and he got tapped out in the fifth round. It happens. That's the way the fight ends. That's the immediate way you could end the fight according to the unified rules and the Nevada Athletic Commission. So he lost that fight. They had a rematch, and then Anderson Silva came back and beat him in the third round, or no, I think it was even the second round. But it was a great rivalry in the UFC. These guys made for great press conferences. These guys made for great interviews and different internet shows and different MMA shows on television. I love this rivalry myself. It's one of my favorites. It was a 2010 time. But yeah, Anderson Silva, Chael Sonnen, one of the great rivalries of the UFC and one of my favorite fights going down. And I feel blessed to say that I was able to also enjoy UFC as a live event. I was able to go to UFC fights and be in the live crowd, whether it was a small fight in Albany, where I went there in, I think, 2013, 2014. That was a great, great fight in Albany. That was a smaller card, a fight night. Then I also had the great pleasure to be at UFC Boston when Chael Sonnen was in the main event against Mauricio Shogun Rue. And in the UFC Boston card, in the preliminaries, a guy named Conor McGregor was making his debut. I think I said maybe not his debut. I think it might have been his second fight there in Boston. Came out to the Shipping Up to Boston theme song. Conor McGregor killed it in the Boston Garden. I was able to be there like 10 rows from the cage side. It was a great, great event to be there. But the best event that I've ever been to was definitely UFC 241, Honda Center. Not Las Vegas. I wish it was Las Vegas now. It was in Anaheim, California. In Anaheim, California, I was able to take a vacation and go down to the West Coast. I enjoyed some time on San Diego beaches. It was a great, great time. But in that time, I was also able to catch a UFC event, which was great. It was the heavyweight championship fight, Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic, and it was a great, great fight. Daniel Cormier wound up winning by TKO, technical knockout. I also got to see Nate Diaz, who is one of the best fighters in UFC history, most popular fighters in UFC history. Some people might debate the best fighter, but he did beat Conor McGregor. I got to see him live. It was a great match that he had. It was just an overall great, great card, and I was able to be there live and able to see a heavyweight championship pay-per-view, which a lot of people don't get to witness, and I feel very, very blessed on that. But that just shows my love for this sport. And today's episode was all based on my favorite sport, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Thank you for joining me today on this YouTube show. My name is Danny HenDog. It rained during some of the clips. If you rewind back, you'll see some rain in the background. It was all a mess in today's podcast, but hey, we finished up. And if you got to this far with me, I thank you. So have a good day. Have a good night. Be blessed and spend the time with the people that you love. And always remember to drink your water and get your workout in. All right. Peace out. Have a good one.